So what made you pursue that particular moment for poetry? Because you'd been in the engineering world for so long, yeah, it was before that.
Well, it's interesting, and I think this is something that that I'm sort of messaging around a lot lately, and this idea of taking more of a liberal. We need to take more of a liberal arts approach to life as our society is getting more complicated and faster and multifaceted and all this stuff. And for me in particular, what happened was I was always a left brain, right brain kid, and was an AB student and everything. So when it came time to decide a career, it was kind of, you know, what society supports mostly is the traditional stuff. And as a working class immigrant family, it was doctor, lawyer, engineer, and I picked the lesser of three evils. And it was actually through engineering that I started writing in engineering a lot, because I had to write letters and reports and proposals, and started paying really close attention to language. And seeing that language was this vibrant, alive thing, that there wasn't one right way to write a sentence, but there were like 50 right ways to write a sentence. And that the idea of audience and tone, so it isn't the same to write a proposal as it is to write a letter to a permitting agent, as it is a letter to write to a councilman. And I just started falling in love with language. And then after a while it was natural. I said, well, I wonder what I can do this and exercise my creative side that had sort of laid dormant for a while. And I just started dueling around with poetry. That was about when I was 24, 25, just completely for fun, and took a class, a couple creative writing classes here in Miami-Dade, and then eventually the graduate class with Campbell, and then just took it from there. And it was really just for the pure passion and enjoyment of writing, of language.
That's awesome. So you're getting both brains working.
Yeah, and one helps. I mean, they both help each other. I mean, I always say I think I'm a better poet because I'm an engineer, but I also think I'm a better engineer because I'm a poet.
Oh, that's a great answer, actually.
Yeah.
So, your family pushing the engineering a little bit more strongly than arts. When you decided to go to the MFA program, did they decide we're going to read your work and support you once you made that decision? Or?
No, well, there's a language barrier, and there's a cultural divide. There's also kind of a class divide too. I mean, it wasn't like my family was talking about Frost or Picasso at the dinner table, and even if they would, it would be about Cuban artists or Cuban writers. So, but even then we didn't talk about it. So there's like a cultural and a sort of a class divide in that sense, you know. They didn't really understand what I was doing for years. They just thought, there goes crazy Ricky again doing something kooky, you know. So they do, of course, supported me emotionally, but they didn't quite grasp the whole thing. And eventually, when I started teaching as a professor and writing, then my mom that was something she could understand. But she would always say, but he's also an engineer. And now, of course, she's just like, you know, this is just glowing all the time.
Oh, yeah. So, in your new memoir, For All of Us One Today, you have the inaugural poems in both Spanish and English. Did you write them in Spanish first, or decide to?
No, they were all written in English, and then I decided to have them. I didn't translate them myself because I thought it was too important a job, and even though I know Spanish, I wasn't educated in Spanish in higher education, so my Spanish vocabulary has its limitations and whatnot. But I wanted it in Spanish for somewhat selfish reasons, for my relatives to be able to read them, and also I think, given who I was as a first Latino, first immigrant, I thought it was important at least to have the poems in there, and especially the official inaugural poem in Spanish, so that not only sort of the sort of Latino, the bilingual Latino kids could get something from that poem, but also their parents who might not be fully bilingual would be able to understand and grasp something of what that poem meant.
So, because you were only the 5th inaugural poet, actually, and the first Latin American poet and the first openly gay inaugural poet.
The first engineer.
And the first engineer.
Yeah.
You are a lot of firsts to a lot of people, even outside of the Latin American community or even the poetry community. So did you feel that kind of pressure of all those firsts? Have you in the last year?
Yeah, I mean, I did feel, in writing the poem at first I felt that I had to that I should be writing a much more politically charged poem, or a poem that was a little more in your face, so to speak. but when I realized that I've never written from that space. I've always sort of written what I like to call myself, and I owe Campbell this sensibility as well, an emotional historian. My job, I feel, as an artist is more so to grasp where people's lives are caught in the flux of some of these situations without needing to make an overt political statement. So I've always written from this space, from the space of the heart versus the space, and not to say that political poetry can't be wonderful and amazing as well. It's just I don't know how to do it very well. So I let that go, and I realized that that to be what I wanted the poem to do was to offer some kind of vision beyond that political sort of stew that we're in right now. And then that in itself was in some ways political, and to say to be apolitical is also in a way to be political. And it's making a statement. It's saying I'm not going to enter this, I'm going to give you something else. And so so there was at the beginning sort of a self-imposed pressure. The White House never said you should write a poem about this. They gave me complete artistic freedom, didn't change a comma. And on the other hand, I don't mind, I may be the only one that may ever say this, but I don't mind labels. I don't mind I don't mind being called the first this or the first that, because I am. I mean, and I don't want anybody to take that story away from me. Now, I think that when we say labels, are we saying stereotypes? That's a different story, and I think people confuse labels with stereotypes, and it's like, no, I am the first Latino immigrant, gay, engineer, inaugural poet. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, if you make certain assumptions of what it means to be Latino, then we have to have a conversation. But I don't mind that either, because I feel like in some ways my job is, or the gift of what I can do, is to help people understand what it's like to be a Cuban growing up in Miami, how that's different than maybe being growing up being Mexican American in San Antonio. I mean, that we get, I don't know everything about every single culture in the world and the subtleties of, and I don't always expect everyone to know everything about my experience, but I want to share it with them to, in a way, be an educator and sort of an agent for a catalyst for real understanding and growth in everyone.
Wow. That's a lot of self-imposed pressure.
Yeah. I don't know where all this is coming from right now. I think since I was talking down there for about an hour straight, you got me going.
So, all these enormous ideas that you are encapsulating in your poetry, did you find that the FIU and the FAE program itself had prepared you for the life of the inaugural poet with all of this?
Well, I could say, as I always say, I got this assignment a long time ago from Campbell McGrath, which is my very first poem in that very first class was write a poem about America, and it became the very first poem and the very first book that I published. So in some ways, FIU and Campbell had started me on that train, or put me on that path to start asking all these questions about America and who my place, that I kind of had, but had never really consciously asked. You kind of go about your life in Miami and you don't realize that you're not mainstream, but that there's a whole other world. And so I think Campbell, and I think the wonderful program, the very caring program at FIU, that sort of does the nurture and gives you that space to really explore. You're not just another sort of poet in a class. They're not there just to be, we're faculty. They really do care about and take a vested interest in what it is that you want to write about. And Campbell certainly was like that. And Campbell was a great sounding board because if his topic is also America, from another, analyzing the other sector of that and what does, is Americana and Chuck E. Cheese and all these other things. And he was a great sounding board because when I was writing poems that weren't transcending what the story was about, he'd say, this is nothing but cultural data, and it was great feedback. It was great to hear that because my audience is not other Cubans. They would get the inside joke. My audience, as I was saying earlier in terms of labels, is to be able to explore and share that experience and transcend it to show how, whether you're Cuban or whatever, that there's these common human denominators that we all have that make the human experience and the human condition, relatable for all of us.
Okay, yeah, that's fantastic to be able to do do that with your poetry. It's a great model for us as students. That being said, in an interview with Poets.org, you said that your influences were like Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Hass, but you called Campbell particularly the little voice in your head. So if you could embody his voice as you were writing the inaugural poem and revising it, what was he saying in your head?
Oh my God, I'm getting all sorts of visions in my head of what Campbell's voice would sound like. I mean, one of the reasons is because he's the only instructor I've ever had. So, in my sense, it's like almost an only child, feeling. He's the only person I've ever really been instructed by, and very hands-on. But what does his voice sound like? I keep on picturing him like some little kind of Campbell, not quite the devil and the angel kind of thing, but somewhere in between. He's like always on my shoulder, like kind of like, I'm like, nah, that's not gonna work. Or it's like, everyone, at most when he gets excited, which he doesn't show excitement too much, it's like, yeah, Rick, I really like that. I like that. Keep that, And it's just that voice he's become the editor in my head. He's replaced my own editor, sort of, in some ways, because I think it was the great gift of him as a teacher was that he gave you just enough praise, but not overpraise you where you'd get too confident. And he'd never give you too much criticism, negative criticism to the point that you got dejected. He always straddled that wonderful line between keeping you working and enthused and engaged, but not thinking, oh, I got this,
How has your relationship with him changed since you graduated before the inaugural poetry thing?
I think it's changed more for him than for me because he keeps on telling me or he'll say in public things like, he's not my student anymore, he's just beyond, but I still like our reading together, he had the book fair, I'm still like, it's Campbell, it's like, he's still like the father figure, he's still like the teacher, the professor, and I think he'll always be. It's just in the same way your parents will never shift that, your vision of your parents is always that. But I think for him, he's obviously, I think for him it's probably changed a little more in that he sort of let me go into the world, and he doesn't think of me as his student in the same way that I think of him as my professor still. But I may be wrong. I'm not sure.
So if you could impart wisdom to not just your own creative writing students, but also other creative writing students from his wisdom that you would pass down, what would it be?
Well, one of those things was obviously what in terms of some of the things you taught me about writing. I think that dynamic that we had about him saying that what I was just saying about cultural data and this is just not going anywhere because it's just so you're eating black beans and rice, big deal. I think what I most learned through that process was this. The irony of art, that the best art should tell your story in the most honest, passionate, real, vivid, detailed way, and yet at the same time it has to transcend your very story if it's going to reach beyond that. And how you do that, I learned through Campbell, is by the choices that you make in your writing, the details that you select, the language, the textures, the images, and that so telling your story is not just about telling your story, it's about offering up your story as sort of an archetype, perhaps a door for other people to understand their own lives. And the poem is almost like a mirror where you and the reader or listener are standing right in front of the mirror, that's the poem, and your lives are blurring. And you're really looking at the author's life, but it's kind of a smoke and mirrors. You're really talking about yourself, but you're really talking about everyone else at the same time. And that's a fine balance in any art. It's how do you tell your story and transcend it at the same time. And writing as an immigrant and writing the story of my parents and grandparents and myself, you always kind of knew that your story wasn't mainstream, so you always kind of wrote, I think, what he taught me is that you got to write with a purpose. You got to tell that story not because the story in and of itself is important, but it's how you choose to tell that story that then transcends the moment and makes it powerful. And I think that was, I gathered from our relationship.
That's awesome. Speaking of that balance with art, I heard some great news that Dave Pilkey is illustrating a children's version of One Today.
Yes.
Congratulations, that's awesome. Are you changing anything to make it more kid-centric, or?
We're still talking about that. It takes forever, and I didn't know. I mean, I didn't know anything about children's books, but apparently this guy is wonderful, and we've had email exchanges, and he's just is wonderful. But it takes forever. So I didn't realize. Of course, they have to like paint 20 paintings. You know, we discussed it briefly. They were afraid to tell me anything because the poem is a little bit long. And I'm totally open to it. The only thing I suggest is we'll put the whole poem in its entirety in the back, you know, just so that if parents want to read or children want to read the entire poem in its entirety, I think it's important that it be there. But it's a long enough poem that I'm learning all the bits about children's publishing, which is its own world. So yeah, we're gonna work with it a little bit. We haven't decided how we're gonna you know, tweak it to maybe pick out the most important images or whatnot, but
that's awesome. I'm really looking forward to it, I have to say. Even if I have to wait years for it, we're looking forward to it.
Well, I saw a video, an animation of the Paperboy, which was, and he caught the line, the plum blush of dusk from the inaugural poem, like perfectly, and I was just crying, and that I was like moved to tears by this children's book, and I was like, that's the one. And luckily, they brought him out of retirement, I think. So.
But, it's going to be a great collaboration, I think.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. Well, we're just about out of time, but I wanted to ask you in conclusion. Writers all the time get asked questions that only pertain to like them being the novelist or the poet, in your case, the inaugural poet.
Right.
But what is one question that you wish interviewers would ask you?
That's a good one. Gosh, outside of anything.
Anything at all.
This is. Gosh, what haven't I told about my life? This is a very scary thing. It's between what you want to ask but you don't want to answer.
That's true.
I don't know, something about my childhood. I don't think that people ask me enough about, like, I think some of what my relationships were like in my family and things with my grandmother in particular and how that shaped my writing. I don't think many people like look at that very, very well. So I don't know if that's a question or not, but there's something I get to speak about not too often is I was kind of very verbally and psychologically abused by my grandmother because of my homosexuality since a little kid, and there's always been great shame in that, and I think that in some ways, I guess this is the question: why do you write? Which is really a weird question to ask, and most people say like, "Oh, because I have to." You don't have to write. I think that I think it was a way for me to heal, and I think it was a way for me to be able to communicate with the world. Because ironically, my grandmother made me a writer. She shut me off from the rest of the world. So she made me this really sort of introverted kid, afraid of the world, afraid of participating in the world and just observing the world. And that made me a pretty good observer of human nature. So I had to survive. I had to learn how to read people to know how to behave. And in some ways, indirectly, she made me a writer, because after all, what do writers do except sit around, look at people, and figure out stories, right? Figure out what's going on in their head and in my head, and understand human nature. So I don't think enough people ask enough questions about some of these outside of the craft questions. You know, some of these questions about what does motivate us to write? Why are some poems come through? And it's, you know, after you take 38 workshops, if you're not getting it, there's another kind of block that has nothing to do with craft. And I think a lot of times it's the emotional door that I call. And it's important to get in touch where that writing space comes from. And I don't think people don't ask writers that enough time. We always assume it's like all about the workshop and the craft, and craft is addressed like almost like a formula sometimes. But as Richard Hugo said, to paraphrase him, it's like some like most writers' problems, like everyone else's, they're psychological ones. And a lot of times, even for the inaugural poems, there has to be every poem is an emotional journey as well as a creative one. And if you're not asking something deep, if you're not asking something really important of yourself, of the world, or of someone else, then I think that's sometimes why when the poem doesn't get there, we're just worried about, oh, I like that line break, or I don't like that line break, or like, what if I do this, or what if I do that? And that's part of the process, that's part of the mix, because your mind's just being entertained while the rest of your subconscious is figuring out. But nobody really has that conversation too often, I think, nowadays, and I'd like people to ask more questions about that kind of space where writing comes from, you know, how we deal with that.
Well,
The spiritual stuff.
that we're all afraid of.
The stuff you can't write. You can't talk about it in workshop because it's not the right format. So I get it, but then we never stop the workshop talk, even outside of workshop, even amongst ourselves. You know, like I think we need to have more dialogues about that. Yeah.
Well, hopefully we can have another dialogue with you about that in the future.
Sure, that'd be great.
Thank you again so much for doing this for us.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
To everything that you're going to do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.